Welcome to the ISO Show, dispelling myths and sharing tips for success to improve your business with ISO standards, with your host, Mel Blackmore.
Hi and welcome to the ISO Show. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm delighted to welcome back Sarah Ball, who's a consultant, who's a specialist in quality, environmental, health and safety and information security standards. And she's been instrumental in developing some awesome content for the ISology Hub, our online platform. So welcome back, Sarah.
Hi Mel, lovely to be here, thank you.
Great. Well, I've invited Sarah on because we're going to be having a chat about legal compliance. Now, I know that might seem like quite a dull and boring subject, but all companies have a legal obligation to comply with legislation. It is the law. There's no getting out of it, and failure to comply to legal requirements can be extremely costly, not just in terms of fines, but also in terms of reputational damage. So, yeah, it is an important factor, and it's something that is touched upon across various ISO standards, because typically there is a requirement to identify and comply and evaluate the effectiveness of legal compliance. Now, obviously, that's going to be more pertinent when we're looking at like the health and safety standard, ISO 45001, or ISO 14001, the environmental standard. Now, we're not going to get into detail about any specific legislative acts today or regulations. We're not going to be covering any particular topic like health and safety. This is just going to be a general conversation about what organisations can do to identify their legal compliance requirements and what they can do to help to keep on top of it. Because what we found in the past is that organisations that don't have an ISO standard generally don't have a legal register. And you might be thinking, well, what the heck is a legal register? And Sarah's going to be explaining all about that shortly. And a legal register is not a requirement of an ISO standard, but it's just a really effective way of being able to capture and monitor and maintain any changes to the law and make sure that management are on top of legal compliance. We'll be talking a bit more about that as we go. So, yeah, in terms of where do we begin then, Sarah? Although a lot of businesses don't necessarily understand what the applicable statutory and regulatory requirements are that they need to comply with, you know, it is important, but obviously not that many businesses take it that seriously. Why do you think it's important to manage legal compliance for a business?
Hi Matt, yeah, I think, as you said, legal compliance is not the most exciting of topics. It's not something generally businesses get really enthused about doing, but it is really important. And it's not only important to follow the law when you know what it is, but it's really important to actively go out and manage your legal compliance, so to take a proactive approach to it. So as you mentioned earlier, there is of course the potential for fines or prosecution, and then the reputational damage that can come along with that, which is really important. No business wants to be in that situation. But more than that, I think it's important to proactively manage your compliance so that you're protecting your business and by extension your staff and even the local community around your business. Because legislation and regulations typically have been introduced in the first place because they're addressing either a risk or because they're there to provide some sort of protection. So there's a kind of almost a moral obligation as well to make sure that you understand what all these obligations are and that you're doing your very best as a business to meet all of those obligations as well. I think proactively identifying compliance obligations is so important because there are huge amounts of legislation, acts and regulations out there, and you're not going to know them all off the top of your head. None of us know them all off the top of our head. So you've got to go and be proactive about finding out what is applicable to your organisation, and then that will give you confidence that you really are understanding and addressing your responsibilities. And obviously, as with all ISO standards, you know, improving where you can.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I was blown away. I remember the first time when I implemented ISO 27001 many years ago. So that's the information security standard. for our ISO listeners that aren't familiar with that particular standard, I was absolutely blown away when I found out that there were around about 60 legislative acts associated with information security. And this was obviously well before GDPR, it was the Data Protection Act, but things like the Computer Misuse Act, and it was fascinating actually. And I remember at the time thinking, how the heck are businesses expected to know about all of these things? And more often than not, businesses don't find out about certain things until they've actually been prosecuted in some cases.
Yeah.
So how can a business identify their compliance obligations?
Well, there's a few ways you can do it, and the most straightforward is going off and researching it yourself. Having a look online and trying to understand what is applicable to your industry. So this might be searching for, the HSE website, for example, to look at what is relevant from a health and safety point of view, and then digging down into all of that information that they have on there to see what's applicable to you. Or it could be about looking at Environment Agency to understand from an environment point of view. A great online resource is the legislation.gov website, which has all of the relevant legislations for the UK on there. But generally you need to know what you're looking for before you're going to find it in that system. So I think general research is the basic starting point for anyone. And there's other ways you can do that, because that is quite a lot of work, let's be honest. So you can take a couple of shortcuts. So one of them would be, if you're a member of any sort of industry body or an organisation that supports businesses in any way, they quite often have information and resources around compliance, which you can tap into, and they've done some of that research for you, so that's a great route to go down. Alternatively, there are subscription services you can use. So these are specific platforms that are designed to give you an overview of specific legislation. You can normally create some sort of profile so that it will help you to identify what legislation might be applicable for you and what regulations are applicable. And then they give you notifications on updates as well, which can be really handy, because of course these requirements do change over time as well, and that's another aspect you've got to take into account, is how you're going to keep on top of those changes. Finally, you can of course engage the services of a specialist company, a consultancy that offers legal advice. Typically they will specialise in one area or another, so it might be health and safety or environmental, or it might be financial or information security. But there are lots of organisations out there that can provide that kind of specialist advice for you.
Yeah, great. So I think basically what you're saying then is that there are free resources, so you don't necessarily need to spend a penny at all to identify that information. It's generally on government websites or on professional body websites, as you mentioned, and they'll have some useful links, which is good. So you don't need to think that this is an expensive journey in understanding what your legal compliance requirements are. And then obviously from a regulatory point of view, it's, going to trade bodies and that sort of thing. And that could actually then mean that you're actively seeking things relevant to your business. Whereas if you went onto a subscription service, which is great to get regular updates, I think there are lots of benefits of the subscription services. Again, it's about understanding what legislation and regulations are relevant to you. And in terms of consultancy, if you've already got like a health and safety consultant that you're working with, then, why not get them to look at that for you? And then, of course, there's always, in terms of understanding how to identify the applicable, statutory, regulatory, contractual requirements, we've got a module over in the ISOlogy Hub, which is part of our ISO roadmap, one of the 7 steps actually to implementing ISO standards. And we've got I think it's about a 15-minute video where we explain that in more detail. And we've got a workbook on how to carry out those activities as well. So you can not just kind of, take that information, but also use it as a method for transformation to start to identify the applicable requirements. So I mentioned earlier about a legal register. Now, this is something that we commonly refer to when we're working with clients, that it's advisable to have one. We know that it doesn't stipulate within an ISO standard, you shall have a legal register. That isn't a requirement. But we know from years of experience that this is just a really effective way of being able to capture all the information that you need. So yes, why would you say, in your experience, Sarah, why would you say it's important to have a legal register?
I think the main thing is, as we touched on earlier, there's a lot of things to remember here, when you're dealing with potentially 60 applicable requirements from an information security point of view, and then you've got finance regulations and health and safety, which can easily be over 100 different legislation and regulations related to that. None of us, or very few people in the world, I think, could remember all of that. So by just documenting it in a register, it gives you that clear visibility, and you can hone in on the things that are really important for you to manage. You've got them written down in front of you, and it's really clear about where you potentially have some gaps as well. The other thing I think that's key with having a legal register is you can assign accountability for each of the obligations that you identify. And I think that's really important in an organisation, that people understand who has ultimate accountability for meeting that particular requirement. It's not necessarily that they have to do all the activities that meet the compliance day to day, but there has to be someone that's overall accountable for that. So having a legal register allows you to not only identify the compliance obligations that are relevant to you, but also who's accountable for delivering against those.
I was just going to say, I remember having a session with you some time ago on the productivity ninja and about the importance of having a second brain, because you can probably explain this a lot better than I can, because obviously your brain's for thinking and processing information, not necessarily remembering everything. And you can't possibly remember. I know that obviously some of our consultants like Steve Mason will probably be able to reel off all of the legislative acts associated with information security, because he has got one of those brains. But for most people, the legal register can be seen as like a second brain, can't it? Which is something that you practice through the Productivity Ninja. And anybody that's wondering what we're talking about, it's a well-known series of books now on improving productivity and getting things done. So we've talked about the legal register, but I think it's going to be quite difficult for those people that haven't got one to visualise what it actually looks like, what the structure of that is. Could you just try and describe that so that we've got some kind of visual image of it, Sarah?
Yeah, of course. So basically it's a table of information. In a nutshell, that's what it is, and you can put it in whatever format suits you. We typically will put it into a spreadsheet just because it's easier to create tables in a spreadsheet, but any format is fine. You've essentially got some columns across the top, and the key things you're going to identify in those are, what's the name of the legislation or the regulation or the contractual obligation that we're talking about. Ideally include a link as well if you can, so that it's easy to access that from your register. Then you want to have a column that sort of summarises the requirement. So what is this obligation mean to you in your organisation, and the purpose as well. So what is the intent behind it? You can then have a link to any additional guidance as well, because quite often there is additional information that can be useful in terms of how you practically approach a particular legislation or regulation requirement. And then I think the really important one is a description of what good looks like for your organisation. So what would be the typical evidence that you might look for when you're evaluating how effectively you're meeting this requirement? So is that going to be a particular type of service record, potentially, if it's to do with health and safety? Is it a particular type of report that you might have? So that column's really key, because you can identify it really specifically to what is right for your organisation. And I think for most people that's the bit that they struggle with compliance, is how does it apply to us and what does it mean for us? And then simply the rows on the table are the different obligations you identify, so it's quite straightforward.
That's a great way of putting it. Thanks very much for describing that, Sarah. And so it's one place, isn't it, that you've got everything there. So it's literally a one-stop legal compliance shop, ultimately.
Absolutely.
The go-to place that everybody within the organisation could access, regardless of whether you're a leader in the business, an employee. Obviously it's going to be key to make sure that is communicated effectively. And as you mentioned earlier about having people that are actually accountable for monitoring that, to make sure that the company is legally compliant and that legal register is kept up to date as well. So
I just get that you can expand those columns if you want to include a column for who is accountable, and you can even have additional columns where you would record whether or not you think you are currently compliant or not compliant, or is there room for improvement as well? So it can become like a live document that you use to manage your compliance overall.
So you could actually use it as an audit tool as well, if you have an extra column to actually capture the evidence of that particular review of compliance and effectiveness of compliance.
Yeah, absolutely. It doesn't have to be just something you create once and then it sits dusty on a shelf kind of thing. You want it to be a live document that gets updated regularly and that people are actively following it and seeking to meet their obligations as best they can.
Yeah. So if any of our ISO show listeners are thinking, yeah, that sounds like a good idea, I need one of those. Other than obviously being a member of the ISOlogy Hub and getting access on how to create a legal register, Sarah, could you just explain for our listeners how you would go about creating a legal register for the first time?
Yes, sure. So the first thing you'll see is create your table in whatever format works for you. And then it's going out and finding those compliance obligations. So through any of the methods that we talked about earlier, you can go and do your own research, or you can use your subscription service or your specialist consultancy, whichever way you want to go. But once you understand what those compliance obligations are, you're going to record those in there. And then I think the accountability is the next key step. So who's going to be accountable within your organisation for each of those items? And you probably want to get a group of relevant stakeholders together to understand what does this obligation mean for us, so that you can fill in that really crucial column on what does good look like, what are we trying to actually make sure we have in place here. And then you can identify how well you're doing. Have you met those obligations? Like you say, do a bit of a mini audit on whether or not you are meeting the compliance obligations as well as you could, or is there area for improvement, or are you not meeting them at all? Obviously, if you identify any gaps, then those need to be addressed. So as a matter of priority, you would need to start addressing those. But the actual process for creating the legal register is fairly straightforward. It's just that research behind it is what takes the time.
Okay, great. And I guess, the next stage then is communication. I think the other consideration is about those other requirements. And I know that sounds quite vague, but it does say, doesn't it, within certain standards about statutory, regulatory and other requirements.
Yes.
And other requirements could literally be any other requirements that you put in there. But actually, I think it's quite an important point for consideration, because it's what other requirements are important for your business. So in some cases, if you have a standard service level agreement, that could be another opportunity for you to review whether you are actually complying with that other requirement that you set out for your clients. Because that's vitally important. And again, if you're using that as an audit tool, that's an example of another requirement. Another requirement could be the standards themselves, which we have seen, haven't we? I think in assessment, sometimes an assessor may say, where is ISO, whatever it is, ISO 14001, in your other requirements? Have you identified that? And where is a copy of that standard? Because so I can see what those other requirements are that you're complying with. That is really down to the business, isn't it? I mean, are there any other tips there, Sarah, on other requirements? Because I know it is quite broad, and our ISO show listeners are probably scratching their head thinking, well, I could put anything in there. But, do I have to put everything in there?
I think you've got to focus in on the things that are important for you, but there are lots of other requirements that could be applicable. So certainly contractual requirements, as you say, there's the SLA, but there may be specific contractual requirements you agree with certain customer groups or just individual customers that you want to make sure are on the radar. I think that's the important thing, that they don't just get lost once you've agreed those in a contract. So any kind of contractual requirements with your customers can go in there, definitely. But also potentially with a landlord, if you've agreed something specific with a landlord, or with any other of your supply chain as well, you can capture those as part of that other requirements. And if you're a member of any trade organisation, so anywhere that has like a code of conduct that you're supposed to be meeting as part of the way that you operate your business, that would be another requirement as well, because by being a member, you are saying that you are going to achieve this certain standard, and that's something, again, you want to keep that visibility of, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Ultimately, what we're saying here then is it's what's important to your business that you want to make sure that you are actually complying with. Yeah. And so you may already have an obligation to comply with a Cyber Essentials scheme or Cyber Essentials Plus. But how is that monitored and measured in terms of the evaluation of the effectiveness of the compliance against that? Again, that's another requirement that may be important to your business that you would like to include in that. And that's basically setting out your stall to say, this is what we're committed to meeting the requirements of on an ongoing basis, and then demonstrating the evidence of that, because in some cases, some organisations will have an audit. It doesn't necessarily mean to be a finance audit or an ISO audit. It could be another stakeholder audit or review. And again, it's another way of demonstrating the level of commitment, certainly to governance and assurance of meeting that company's obligations. So, great. Oh, thanks very much for sharing all that with us, Sarah. Is there anything else you'd like to leave us with?
I think one thing I found a legal register useful for in the past as well is that when you're looking at either developing new processes or improving existing processes, it's a great resource to go back to and make sure that any changes you're making are not going to impact anything that you need to do in terms of compliance, so that you don't, design out some of your compliance activities just because you've forgotten, you don't remember that you needed to do that. So a legal register can be a great resource in that process improvement activity as well.
Yeah, no, love that last tip. Thanks very much for leaving us with that, Sarah. And I've really enjoyed chatting with you today about legal compliance and the importance of, and just, thanks for sharing your advice on how organisations can develop a legal register and put that to good use. So, thanks very much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. It's been great.
Cool. So, some of the things that I mentioned will be in the ISO show notes. So if you go into over to our website, you'll be able to get access to that. And obviously to the show notes, you'll get the links for whichever media channel you're listening to your podcast on today. So thanks very much for joining us, and I look forward to catching up with you on the next ISO show.
Looking to use ISO standards to drive better business practice? Contact us at blackmoresuk.com to access further information and book your free 15-minute call.